My name is Clecump. It's my Cascade name, and I'm named after one of my great aunts. But my government name is Alicia Aguilar, and I am a descendant of the Warm Springs Confederated Tribes.
Alicia Aguilar and her husband spend a lot of time here on the lower Deschutes River.
Hey, look, there's a big fat otter over there. See it?
Otter.
Right, big otter. Right? He's right behind that tuft. He's getting right. Yep. He's huge.
They work as fly fishing guides. This river sustains them in more ways than one. It's essential for their mental health.
Yeah, if we don't come out here weekly, daily, we'll lose it, literally. I mean, even if we can't fish, we got to come out to the river.
They have already lost a lot due to long-term drought. Much of Oregon has seen severely dry summers 4 out of the last 5 years, bringing more intense wildfires along with water shortages. Aguilar is anticipating the ripple effects of ongoing drought across the Deschutes Basin.
With the snow melting as fast as it has, the huckleberries are probably going to be smaller. The choke cherries, everything that we harvest, the roots, the celery, everything will come earlier rather than on time. Everything's changing now, whether it's the salmon fly hatch are coming up earlier or our first foods are coming in harvest way earlier than expected. So you can't control it. You have to go with it now.
Aguilar and her husband say they didn't always understand the impact of the farms and other businesses that compete for the water the wildlife depend on.
I used to think, oh, it's so beautiful. Look at how green the fields are and everything. And now I'm just disgusted. I'm like looking at every single field, looking at all these cows, more and more black cows, Angus, whatever. And
golf courses, wine shops, marijuana dispensary, groweries going up, like
alfalfa hayfield. It's kind of like a slap in the face because as first people, our first foods are very, like we keep saying, they're very hardly here and they're medicine. We need them. It's frustrating to say the least.
So with ongoing drought and water shortages, how do local governments decide how to allocate this precious resource to farms, homes, wildlife, and commercial uses like golf courses and resorts?
Actually, state government doesn't discriminate between different kinds of water users.
Wait, for real?
Yeah, it's essentially based on seniority.
Wow. Okay. That is Emily Curitin-Cook, OPB's Central Oregon Bureau Chief, and I am so glad she's here with us today because she's going to explain to us how water users are responding to years of drought that's just now beginning to ease, and how this complicated system of water rights actually works. Oh, and I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. So, we've done a couple episodes of The Evergreen at this point that are about water issues and water policy, and I just gotta say, water rights are pretty confusing. Emily, will you give us a little breakdown of how water rights are allocated in Central Oregon in 2024?
Yeah, it's similar to how it's done all across the West. Many places, the majority of the water in Central Oregon goes to irrigation. And the system by which it's divvied up is called prior appropriation, or a lot of people just say first in time, first in right. Basically, that means that the people who hold the oldest water rights get top priority when there isn't enough water to go around. And some of the water rights in Central Oregon date back to 1900, and they've been passed down along with private property for generations. Central Oregon Irrigation District Managing Director Craig Harrell put it pretty succinctly.
I always say that my grandfather started his business before your grandfather on the main street. It's first come, first serve.
Okay, so first come, first served. So who are the water users who are getting top priority in Central Oregon?
They're people that own land served by these irrigation districts with the old water rights. So that's farms, ranches, resorts are some of the big ones. And collectively, they take about 90% of the Deschutes River, and it's diverted to canals near Bend during the growing season. And who gets to use the water is set by these state permits, which we're calling water rights, authorizing people to use a certain amount at a particular place. And these permits have become wed to private property values. So the oldest water rights are often part and parcel of the most valuable land. In the Central Oregon Irrigation District, that's the one where the water rights go back to 1900. They send out about 3,600 bills every year to people and entities with water rights in that district. And to be clear, these bills aren't for the water itself. This might surprise you, Jen, but the water is free. The bills are actually just for the infrastructure to deliver the water to certain areas.
Got it.
So just as an example, here's one case study. Near the top of the list of the biggest landowners who pay these fees to COID is Nike co-founder Phil Knight's horse farm and hay growing operation. The Knight Joint Trust has over 200 acres near Redmond. And this year, it paid just under $10,000 to get water from the Deschutes River delivered to that operation. That breaks down to about $45 a year an acre. And to me, that's just really interesting because the way those fees are assessed, the big landowners actually end up paying a lot less per acre than people with really small parcels, regardless of how much water they use or how efficient they are with the water.
That is really interesting. So, we're talking about Phil Knight, for example. Who else is competing for water?
The main thing you need to know is that there are more people or entities who have been granted water rights than there is actual water in the Deschutes Basin. This is not a new problem either. Like by 1913, the river was already spoken for and then some. So the list is long. We heard a few of the competing interests earlier. In addition to the interests I've already mentioned, the tribes depend on water from the Deschutes. Bobby Bruno is the CEO for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs.
The water for our community, which is the number one gift the Creator gave us, is, we use water in Warm Springs. We draw it straight from the Deschutes River for the community of Warm Springs, and making sure that we have good, clean water for our community, but also sustainable water for future generations.
As we heard earlier, water is also essential for fish and other wildlife, as well as plants that grow along the river. Cities are water users too, but they don't actually use nearly as much as rural areas. Redmond and Bend account for less than 5% of water use in the Deschutes Basin. Climate change and years of drought has certainly heightened all of these tensions among different water users. Kate Fitzpatrick is the executive director of the Deschutes River Conservancy.
Every year is a drought year for the streams because of the over-allocation of water rights, but it's making it harder to do projects. It's making it harder for irrigators to get water in the summer. It's contributing to the groundwater declines that we're talking about. That is a major challenge for the basin and a challenge for the cities to get future water supplies as well.
The Deschutes River Conservancy actually has a really interesting history.
We were formed by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in partnership with Irrigation and the Environment. On the heels of the Spotted Owl timber wars, really trying to address water proactively and avoid conflicts by working together as a community.
Coming up after a short break, we'll hear more about how collaboration is working in Central Oregon when it comes to water. Stay with us. So clearly, there's a lot of potential for fights over water in Central Oregon. And 10 years ago, new federal protections for an endangered species, this time it was the Oregon spotted frog, made it seem like farmers with junior water rights might lose everything. Emily, in the absence of state oversight, what have water users been doing to make things more equitable in the region?
One thing they've done is create a more efficient system to actually get water from the river to farmlands.
So we live in a volcanic porous landscape. And so when the water gets diverted, it travels through hundreds of miles of canals to get to the farm. And those canals seep into the aquifer. And so you have to send twice as much water to the farm that you would if you had a pipe system.
Okay, so now they use pipes instead?
Yeah, pressurized pipes are a highly effective alternative to the canals, but they also cost a lot of money. So a coalition of tribal, agricultural, and environmental groups has come together to make it happen. And over the last 2 decades, they've made a lot of progress, and there's still a long way to go. Piping has so far conserved more water than any other conservation method being used on the river. And there is federal money that has come in to help the projects along. They're able to conserve enough to transfer some of that water that would have gone to the senior water rights holders to farmers who are farther down the line and don't have as powerful of water rights.
All right, so farmers are able to share more water thanks to these pipes. But what about the wildlife that depend on the river?
The Deschutes River Conservancy pays people with older water rights to just leave them in the river. Sometimes they purchase the water rights outright, and sometimes they lease them temporarily for as long as the landowners are willing.
There's more than just money at stake for these landowners. If they can't use all of their water, they risk losing their rights to it.
So if you have a water right and you have a 1900 priority date, that's a good, reliable water rate. I would pay you a little bit of money. You would lease that water to the state. Basically, we'll fill out the paperwork, submit it to the state, and the state actually protects that water and stream. So it's also very useful for water rights holders because it counts as a year of beneficial use. And so you kind of protect your water from that forfeiture.
This use it or lose it scenario can be very motivating for people. If someone has valuable senior water rights attached to their property, but they don't actually need to use them, they can lease them out every year to the River Conservancy and keep those water rights and the value that they bring to the property. That seems like a pretty clever workaround. But Emily, now I'm wondering why the state doesn't just update the laws so that water can be shared more equitably without this delicate logistical balancing act.
Simple question, Jen. I'm smiling because changing these laws is very politically fraught, and attempts to do so over the decades have often failed. Even though some landowners are into the idea of selling or leasing their water rights to the state, there is still some fear that if the law changes, that will lead to farmland being permanently converted into other uses. Powerful lobbying groups representing industry groups like hay farmers and the nursery industry have pushed hard against changes at the legislative level.
Well, do you think there could be any movement there as we've mentioned, climate change is making the situation more urgent for water users?
Yeah, I do. Oregon Governor Tina Kotek is putting exceptional pressure on lawmakers to make some moves in the next session in 2025. The Senate Interim Committee on Natural Resources and Wildfire recently held an informational hearing that included a pretty robust discussion of water rights. Here's a brief exchange from that hearing between Oregon State Senator Fred Drought and Attorney Josh Newton, who was serving as a subject matter expert. Newton also represents the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs on a number of water rights issues. Senator Drought speaks first.
The question is, if we tried to modernize that, wouldn't there be winners and losers? That would be question number one.
So, Senator, I think that is a great question. And I think invariably at some level there would be, and it's basin by basin because it's a scarce resource. At some point, there's not enough of the resource to go around, right? But having said that, if I just think about the Deschutes Basin, we have worked together in a collaborative way to try to minimize winners and losers and work to find conservation opportunities that puts water in the stream, creates more certainty for ag uses, municipal uses, and everything else. So I tend to think the opportunity resides in focusing on that.
Towards the end of the hearing, State Senator Floyd Przonski had this to say.
We have winners and losers right now. Based on a 1800 document and policy that we have, we need to look at how can we do it better, because I think one of the largest losers right now is the public. We have this finite resource, as far as I'm concerned, that we have to protect, and we have to make certain we do everything we can. And yes, there will be some adjustments for people to do, but at the same time, on the long run, our future generations more than likely will have the water they need to be Oregonians.
So, Emily, what goes through your mind when you hear that from a state senator?
Well, the idea that the biggest loser is often the public really resonates with me. In reporting on water rights the last few years, I've been really struck by how the vast majority of Oregonians don't have any water rights. And the vast majority of water goes to the relatively few entities with irrigation water rights. But I also think it's important to note that these lawmakers are not seriously considering throwing out prior appropriation, that first in time, first in right system. What we can expect in the next legislative session are more serious conversations about how regulation can work within the existing system to make water supply sustainable.
So we've been talking about surface water here, water that comes out of rivers, but there's also water that can be pumped out of underground aquifers. And I know this is a whole other complicated topic and maybe a future evergreen episode, but how much do we know about Central Oregon's groundwater? And is groundwater usage regulated as well?
Yeah, it sure is. And the Deschutes is special because we've known for a long time that the snowmelt, the streams, and the rivers are all really directly connected to the groundwater and the springs. And because that is such a well-documented scientific fact, about 25 years ago, the Basin got legislation to force people who wanted to use new sources of water to figure out ways to mitigate those impacts. So the Basin has these tailor-made protections for surface water so that someone can't get a new water right unless one is retired elsewhere. People who want to build wells and pump groundwater, that means they have to buy up surface water rights and then give them back to the stream. This system, it has a lot of wonk, it has a lot of details, but overall, it has done wonders for flows in the river, but it doesn't protect groundwater. And aquifer declines in the region are setting off alarm bells right now for state regulators. This attention and the potential regulation coming from it impacts cities disproportionately because, well, they're growing. And cities have state mandates to build more housing. And places like Bend and Redmond are saying that they can't plan for that future without certainty around water. And just another picture I kind of want to paint for you, Jen, is to keep in mind with all this water moving around and the river moving and everything, the water underground is also moving. It's not like the groundwater is just sitting there in some giant underground pond waiting for us to suck it out. It flows out of the mountains towards the lowest point, and along the way, it's recharging the rivers and springs. So if someone taps into that groundwater, they're taking water that would have flowed downstream to other communities, like where we began on the Warm Springs Reservation.
Okay, got it. And I got to say, I have this very vivid picture in my mind of all of this water moving in different ways throughout the region. So, thank you for that. So as we've said, there have been multiple years in the past where this region has been hit by a serious drought. What is the outlook for this summer in Central Oregon?
It's rosier, with some serious caveats. The good news is that for the first time since 2019, statewide, we have no, as I speak, drought conditions in Oregon. And so that's a little bit of a bright spot.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we'll take it. But here's the bad news. A single good year doesn't fix things, especially for groundwater. I spoke to the Oregon Water Resource Department Regional Manager Carolyn Suffett about this recently.
There's a couple spaces that are in the abnormally dry conditions, but we had a really great year or winter of a nice snowpack and good precipitation.
Does that mean I should be busting out the ticker tape and celebrating that drought is over?
No, I wouldn't do that quite yet. While we are in good conditions right now, those conditions can change rapidly over the summer months, and we've had a lot of really poor water years in a row. So we do see the effects of that in spring inflow into the rivers.
Suffett told me that some Central Oregon springs are still flowing at historical lows, and that's in spite of a good year of rain and snow.
Okay, so we're talking about this summer. What about farther down the line? As we heard, climate change is putting more pressure on the region and, of course, making water even more scarce. So is this collaboration that's thriving now going to be enough if things get progressively worse?
I'm going to go with no. The collaboration has focused on very specific goals, like saving the spotted frogs in the upper Deschutes by making it easier for irrigation districts to conserve water. The frogs are doing better, but with more persistent drought and less water available, there are lower reaches of the river that don't have in-stream protections and don't consistently get enough water, including to support commercial farms like those near Madras. Policymakers in the region are starting to lobby legislators to look at another basin-specific plan rather than having state regulators pursue something more broad that might cut off permits for new wells in growing cities.
Emily, thank you so much for sharing some of your reporting with us. I know you have been covering this for quite a while, so I am sure we will be talking about this again.
You're very welcome anytime.
Emily Curitin Cook is OPB's Central Oregon Bureau Chief. You can read her story about compromises over water use in the Deschutes Basin at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Join us next week for the latest dispatch from our ongoing At Work With series, where we ask Pacific Northwesterners in different jobs your questions about what it's like to do what they do. This time, we'll hear from a poet laureate, a rural mail carrier, and a family of candy makers on the Oregon coast. If you're here listening right now, you are part of our new podcast family. Help us grow by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app, including YouTube. Follow us there, and hey, tell your friends. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. He also engineered this episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Van Wing. Emily Curitin Cook and Dave Miller did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode comes from Audio Network. And don't forget, if you ever have a question for us about water policy or anything else, please reach out. You can hit us up by email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.